when you account for sick days and just like, gluttonous portfolios of real estate that had way too many square feet per active user of the space, we're talking about metrics of like, 50% occupancy levels of space. Those terms and the recognition of that literally didn't even enter my mind pre-pandemic. Nobody in my industry talked about it. It wasn't relevant. We were literally just looking at like, if someone said to us, I need space for 1,000 people, we'd say, great, well, you need 150 square feet a person. It was like, we just did it off the back of a napkin.
Hi, I'm Rob Sadow, and you're listening to the Flex Perspectives podcast, where we interview the world's best thinkers, researchers, and operators on how to make flexible work work. Flex Perspectives is brought to you by Flex Index, the leading global insight platform for flexible work. Flex Index covers flexible work strategies for more than 10,000 companies across 75,000 office locations and 100 million people. Today, my guest is Dave Cairns. Dave is a future of work strategist at Kadence, and prior to that, an SVP at CBRE Canada. In this episode, Dave talks about how his experience as a professional poker player shaped his perspective on the future of work. We explore the changing dynamics of real estate brokerage, how the way we evaluate office-based productivity has changed, and where we're headed on work location flexibility. If you enjoy this podcast, please help us out by subscribing and giving us a rating. It helps us understand what episodes our listeners find most valuable and helps new listeners find the podcast.
This episode of Flex Perspectives is brought to you by Office Benchmarks. In today's hybrid world, workplace executives face critical lease and space allocation decisions. Make the wrong move and it could cost millions, impact productivity, and hurt retention. You need reliable data, not news headlines. That's why companies like TD Bank, Southwest, and Chime rely on Office Benchmarks. Office Benchmarks is the only solution that combines flexible work policy and office usage metrics to help workplace leaders compare their footprint, space design, and usage to peers with similar policies. Get started today at flex.scoopforwork.com.
Dave Cairns with us. Dave, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. And thank you for also clarifying the pronunciation of your last name for me.
For what it's worth, 99 and 100 get it wrong. And so if you'd gotten it wrong, you would have been in great company. It happens all the time.
Well, you've had great company on this podcast, so I must be, yeah.
I appreciate it. So Dave, I want to talk a little bit about, for a second, just about what you do, because I want to make sure people understand kind of like what you're doing right now. But then I'm going to go wind back and we'll talk a lot about your history and things you've done. But you are a future of work strategist at Kadence. What is a future of work strategist?
It's a good question. It's a fancy title, first and foremost, which is the most important part of it, right, Rob?
Let's get on a business card. Right?
Yeah, exactly. No, I think that what I'm out there trying to do is seed conversations about the changing landscape of work with potential customers for Kadence. Obviously, I wear a sales hat within the company, but I also wear the hat of being an ambassador for the brand and someone who's there to provoke conversation both online on platforms like LinkedIn and also in direct conversations with customers to try to get them to think differently, look around the corner. Ultimately, what our company is trying to do is better coordinate digital and in-office experiences. I think that much like yourself, we believe that we will eventually get to the point where flexible working will be something that happens at scale. Gone will be the days of mandates and all of that type of stuff. But in order to get there, we actually need to be a better aligning people and spaces. The majority of companies are in a hybrid moment, whether they like it or not. They can't go back to being fully in office, and they can't just flip a switch and be Atlassian either. And so for them to become more flexible, they need better people coordination. And that's what our tool helps them do.
If you figure out that switch, though, I think there's probably a bunch of companies that would flip a switch and be Atlassian if they could. So I think that would be an attractive growth strategy. So we're going to talk a lot about this, right? And we'll talk about real estate and the relationship between people and place. But I want to wind the clock back because, if you and I were having this conversation 15 years ago in 2009, or you'd probably be pretty hard to kind of like predict some of the things that we're talking about. I believe, if I understand correctly, you won a poker tournament in 2009 that netted you how much? Like, tell me a little bit about the story and how that changed your life.
Yeah, it's so weird to look back. But yes, I did win a massive poker tournament online one night in college. It had around 8,500 players in it from all around the world. Each put up $200 in an online tournament. And I won it for 270,000 Canadian. And it changed my life. I split the winnings actually with a friend of mine, but I was fortunate to be the one that won it on my screen name, which gave me the notoriety, sort of the resume to then go and get an investor, which was what I did. And I became a pro poker player for sort of the next 5 years after that. I'll turn it back to you, but just to sort of riff on it, what I was at the time without knowing it was a location and time independent worker, learning how to collaborate and get the job done online first. Always, that was the mode that we did first. We played in person. I traveled to Vegas and other parts of the world. I also played in person with other poker players local in my city, or when I was traveling to other cities online, but together. But I think that without knowing it, that formed a huge part of my worldview, that then I was able to kind of like draw on in COVID once this whole remote work revolution kind of just like took us all by storm.
Was there ever a thought to be a poker player forever? Like, did you think maybe that was going to be your career?
That's a great question. And no, actually, I definitively knew that I did not want to be a poker player long term. That was actually, I think, the one sort of like innate mature thing that lived inside of me at that time in my life. I was not a very mature person, but I just kind of said to myself, like, how can I be like 45 and have a kid and a family and hold this all together? It seems like it's a very challenging thing to do with all of those things. So that's actually one of the reasons I got an investor, because I said to myself, if I'm going to do this, I'd rather swing for the fences than grind out a living. I could have made a few $100,000 a year just off my own dime, but I thought, let's give it a try at the big time. And that was actually because I knew I wouldn't do it forever.
That's interesting. It's super interesting. And so you did that for, I think you said, was it 5 years that you did it, or?
Yeah, I did it semi-pro in university, and then for like 3 years full time. So I would say in total it was about 5 years, because I really played poker more than I went to college.
Got it. And so you made the decision early on, it wasn't going to be permanent. You did poker for a while, and then somehow you managed to move your way into a totally different world in some ways, which is brokerage. And so how did that transition happen, and what attracted you to the industry in the first place?
Yeah, well, circumstance was a big part of it. The DOJ in the US indicted the two largest online poker websites in 2011 for tax evasion, money laundering, wire fraud, a whole host of charges, and consequently also made it illegal for anyone in the United States to play poker online. And so it was an inflection point. It was this before-after moment where I had a choice. Do I want to keep doing this? Because the games were materially different. They were smaller and harder. By eliminating the US player pool, you took out the biggest part of the economy and the biggest percentage of amateur players, which
like the easy money basically came out of poker at that time. Okay.
Correct. So yeah, I was kind of disenchanted with the lifestyle that I was living at that time. I was kind of, I was nudging myself away from the game a little bit. So in a way, it was kind of a blessing in disguise that happened. But the circumstance part is that, I kind of firmly believe, at least in my own personal experience, that like you don't usually make big changes in life unless you're forced to. We're human. We resist change. So with that being said, I was a bit lost, and I had friends and family that were in the real estate industry, and they said, "Look, why don't you give this a try? Like, you're good with people, you've got good analytical skills, and you're used to not making a salary." And I'm like, "Yeah, salary? What are you talking about? Like 85% of the days that I woke up, I lost money. 15% of the days that I woke up, I hoped to make it back plus some profit." Like the idea of just like being neutral at the end of a working day was something that seemed pretty appealing.
Pretty crazy to think about when you put it that way.
Yeah. So that's how I kind of got into it. Just sort of like another leap of faith, friends and family in the industry, feeling like I could apply the skills that I had in this domain was really all that it was.
Got it. And so a lot of folks who listen are very familiar with real estate brokers, some people less so, but tell me a little bit about the job. Like, what was it? How did it work for you? What's the experience day to day? Like, what was your life like as you made the switch?
Yeah. So it's got very little structure being a real estate broker. And so I think that lends well to someone like me who has a hard time with structure. But, there's no salary at all in North America. So you're on 100% commission. in the first like sort of year to 18 months, the brokerage that you work for will give you like a some form of salary or a draw that you either get or you have to pay back, depending on what brokerage you work at. But that stops after like 12 or 18 months, and then you're literally just on your own. So yeah, that's not appealing to most people, but to me it was, because I felt like I could, like having control of my own schedule was really the only way I was going to be able to even exist in a corporate environment. So yeah, the things that are unique about it from a sales and competition perspective are very, very unique to the industry. You're geographically constrained in terms of most of the prospects that you can go after. You can work with customers across multiple geographies, and you can represent them as sort of their single point of contact, but like 50% or more of your revenue is going to come from local transactions that you're doing in whatever city that you actually reside in. And so why that geographical constraint is challenging is you end up competing with not only your peers, not only your competitors outside of the brokerage that you work for, but also your peers inside the company that you work for. So that is an arguably toxic working dynamic that can, bring up some interesting stuff.
And so what does it look like in practice as you built your client base, the transaction process, even like, can you paint the picture a little bit of like, what was life as a broker like in this pre-hybrid work era, and how did deals get done, and kind of like, how'd you build your business that way?
Yeah, so I rode a really big up wave in the commercial real estate sector. I got in 2012, and I only left this year. So I was there, I guess, from 2012 to 2024. And until COVID, like literally the market just went like this. There was no vacancy, tons of pent up demand. The technology sector in markets like Toronto were just booming. Like to paint you a picture, sort of like circa 2015 to 2020, tech companies, a lot of the ones that you track in the sort of like SMB sector, they probably only represented about 5% of the inventory of office space in a city like Toronto. So if Toronto is like 70 million square feet, roughly 5% of that, what is that, 3.5 million? But they were about 25% of the demand for new space in the market. And wow. So you could make a pretty good living literally just getting in with a startup company and then growing with them over, a 3 to 5 year period, because they were all taking space and then outgrowing it and needing to sublease it and then get a bigger space. And so, on the one hand, it was really great in that sense. The challenge actually came where, as a broker, you would often be commoditized, because if you couldn't, like, there was not a lot of negotiating leverage in a market that had no vacancy, right? Mm-hmm. Like you couldn't, the levers you could pull on in representing your customers were very low for a lot of the years that I was in the industry. So why I say that commoditized us is we were really only as good as the space that we could chuck in front of a prospect. And so, and that created a lot of disloyalty as well, right? Where like customers were really, because of the scarcity of supply of space, they were literally willing to work with any broker that put the right space in front of them at that time, because they were just scared, kind of like the housing market. Like, like in those years, same thing with housing. Like you go in tour a house, you'd be ready to make an offer because you're just like, they'd be fine.
Yeah, basically when you're supply constrained, it's like anybody who can bring me supply effectively is like, I'll work with that person as long as I can get the space.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So to kind of round this out, Rob, because of those dynamics, like new development pipeline, like in every major city, there to try to actually meet like all this pent up demand, right? And the booming tech sector and all of that, we just didn't have to think beyond our noses about the changing landscape of work. Like I've said before, as a real estate broker, all I really needed was knowledge of the commercial real estate sector at a very rudimentary level around like rent, vacancy, like, new buildings coming on stream, big blocks of space that are coming back to the market. It was rudimentary knowledge that I needed, and emotional intelligence to sell my services. When the pandemic hit, I was like, holy crap, like I actually need to now understand more about work itself. And I think that that's one of the sort of unique parts about me was my background in poker and my comfort levels with remote working and distributed working, I think like allowed me to reopen my mind to all of those concepts with a very beginner's mind to it. But for most of the real estate industry, this was highly threatening, everything that was going on, right? I'll stop there for a second because I could just tell you like all kinds of different stories. But I found myself to be in a very unique spot just because of my background. And that actually, it put me in great rapport with a lot of customers, potential customers and industry peers like you. But I became threatening actually to a lot of people in the commercial real estate sector.
It's understandable. Yeah. I mean, what's interesting about, if I understand correctly what you're saying, is you go from an environment where there's no supply of space. And so commercial real estate executive on the occupier side will go work with whoever they can work with, and that's kind of like oversimplification, but whoever can bring them the right space at the right, like will go work. All of a sudden the dynamic kind of like flips, right? And then all of a sudden you've got fundamentally different question. How does it change as you were describing your need to like better understand work? Like, how does the broker skill set have to change to kind of like evolve with that? Or has it changed at all to try and like keep up with this a very different paradigm in space?
Yeah, well, you're making me think of an Upton Sinclair quote that I think needs modernization, but I'll say it in its original form. It's impossible to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it. So that, I think, is actually first and foremost the challenge that any individual faces in a situation where they're being disrupted, right? Whether it's a personal or professional example that we want to cite. And so it starts with self-awareness. It starts with the recognition that, for me, what I would say to brokers, I would say, look, like pre-pandemic offices were already massively underperforming. We didn't really need to worry about that because our customers weren't specifically all worried about that, right?
And when you say massively underperforming, because I want to stop there for a second, because I bet there's a bunch of people listening, like, what do you mean by massively underperforming? Like, how would you describe that in practice?
Yeah, well, I mean, at the most basic level, badging in and badging out of an office, not necessarily we're not going to talk here for, about actual utilization of space and how long it's used and why it's used and all that. But, when you account for sick days and just like, gluttonous portfolios of real estate that had way too many square feet per active user of the space, we're talking about metrics of like, 50% occupancy levels of space. Those terms and the recognition of that literally didn't even enter my mind pre-pandemic. Nobody in my industry talked about it. It wasn't relevant. We were literally just looking at like, if someone said to us, I need space for 1,000 people, we'd say, great. Well, you need 150 square feet a person. It was like, we just did it off the back of a napkin. But then I found out by interacting with folks more like you that were outside of the brokerage world that offices were failing before the pandemic. And now they're only 50% as full as they were before. So they're really not doing very well, right? And so like it floors me, Rob. To give you some context, the entertainment district in downtown Toronto, which is known for housing all of the SMB tech startup companies, right? That submarket had sub 2% vacancy pre-pandemic. I had customers that were literally paying for IKEA furniture simply to try to win out in a competitive sublease agreement, right? Like who could pay the most for IKEA furniture was basically the dynamic in 2019, right? Fast forward to today, those same submarket is like 30% vacant, right? That shows a structural shift in the behavior of companies going forward, right? Because you guys have talked about this in your research. Companies that are formed sort of like circa 2011 and later are far more amenable to either working from home or not from a central office, right? And so what we really don't know definitively is how the companies that were born roughly around the pandemic or after the pandemic are going to behave in terms of their reliance on office space. The only thing that we can say for sure is that they'll be less reliant on it than even those companies from 2011, right? And so this is a change. This is a societal shift in thinking. Like I had this insight with my wife. Sorry, I shouldn't say I had this insight. My wife had this insight the other day. We're walking and she goes, CEOs used to have employees that worked at their companies. Now they have people that work at their companies and they're pissed. They want their employees back. Right? Like this is the shift. That's why there's 30% vacancy in the same submarket that was competing for IKEA furniture.
The other piece of it, though, and I think a lot of what you said rings true, but at the same time, I think the asset, and you can tell me if this feels right or not, you've been closer to this, but I think the asset is viewed differently today than it was prior to the pandemic, in the sense that if you were a real estate executive on the occupier side, and to the point you just described, supply was pretty tight pre-pandemic, leases were long, the worst thing that could happen is you could run out of space. Like that was the number one fear, I think, of any executive on the occupier side, is I run out of space, right? Because that's not a quick solve. I can't go get more space in my building. I don't know where there's going to be more space. And so I'm willing to trade a lot of vacancy within my space to ensure I don't run into that immutable outcome, right? And so I think there's also an underlying dynamic change, which is in a 30% vacancy world versus a 2% vacancy world, and with a lot of other types of properties starting to emerge that help fit the gap, in terms of if I run out of space or I need more flexible space, it shifts the way you think about that asset entirely. And as a result, like what performance you could expect out of that asset that's appropriate relative to it being kind of a different liquidity profile almost than it was prior to the pandemic.
Yeah. You're making me. To me, you made me think of three different customer profiles for the office when you said that. The first one is the SMB startup company that has basically gone remote first. Those companies are like comfortable trading off some of the benefits of the office, if like it's not just definitively obvious why they're paying money for the use of that space. So they're likely to really push forward the on-demand or the flexible real estate sector. I do think that moment has yet to really arrive, though, because you look at a market like Toronto, it started with such low vacancy that we're still actually in a spot where a lot of landlords are sort of still doing okay. So it's going to take more time for them to feel more pain to then embrace on-demand in the way that we have in other sectors like Uber and Airbnb and whatever else. And I think these really young companies will drive that because their mindset is just going to be so vastly different. Then if I go to the other end of the spectrum, you've got really, really large multinational companies who already had underperforming real estate portfolios pre-pandemic. They knew this. They were doing something about it already. They're just becoming more aggressive. So like I was working with a big Canadian bank, I won't name them, but they consolidated into a new development. And they had, they were chopping off a ton of office space in Toronto. This deal got done in 2017. So this is, like I said, a pre-pandemic thing. But now, because of what the pandemic has unearthed, they're probably dropping another 600,000 to 800,000 square feet in downtown Toronto that they hadn't intended to, right? So that means that they're going to be more aggressive. But then there's this interesting one in the middle. There's really well capitalized, somewhat mature technology companies that are growing in headcount. And in a market like Toronto, where talent is just so attractive because the cost of acquiring that talent from a real estate perspective, from a salary perspective, et cetera, is lower than places like the United States. They actually do want to hold on to and may take more real estate than they need in buildings that are high quality and transit oriented for the same reasons actually that were there pre-pandemic. They might view a specific asset or opportunity to be scarce, even in a market that has a ton of vacancy.
It's so interesting. It strikes me then the fundamental question is what happens to the SMBs as they move into the middle segment, right? Like in some ways, it's like if you've got a lot of companies, and we see this in our own data, right? Like if you look at companies with less than 500 employees across the US, Canada, a number of markets, percentage of those firms that are fully remote or employee's choice, meaning no required office time, is very high. I think it's like almost 3/4 or something like that. If they stay that way when they get to 500 employees or more, it's a totally different world for real estate in the way you're describing. If they move into more structured models where they start to fall more into that second and third camp, very different environment. I think that's one of the things that remains to be seen, feels like, over the coming years.
My prediction is that they will behave differently than the company profile that I just mentioned, because the mature company that is looking at space like it's scarce if it's in a high quality building and really transit oriented, those companies were founded, maybe in and around 2010 or even maybe a little bit earlier or a little bit later, but their mindset is still going to be rooted more in the 2019 world, even in 2024. Whereas the companies that have not reached that scale yet, I just can't see how they're going to think that way. I'm not here to say they don't need office space. I think they do. But the reliance on it will be far less, which means their behavior will look different than we've ever seen, I think.
So what's the implication for brokers, to kind of pull back to where we were before? You talked about how the dynamics have changed fundamentally. I imagine it's a much harder market, for a broker in terms of just the total transaction value and number of deals getting done relative to the number of brokers. And so how does that change the job or the way they have to think about approaching clients or competitive landscape? I'm curious kind of what your take is on what's going on.
Well, right now, actually, when I talk to some of my colleagues are having really, really good years, which is indicative of past economic cycles as well. Brokers make money when there's change. So recessions can actually be times where brokers historically have made some of the most money they've ever made. But I think what's different about this moment is that its impact will be lasting. We're talking about structural vacancy existing in most major North American markets that we aren't really sure what to even do with. So I actually feel for the younger people that are coming into this industry, into the brokerage industry, for a couple of reasons. One, take away the dynamics of the real estate market. It's a very archaic sector that has not evolved in the ways that others have. If you just even look at the ways that people collaborate within the brokerage world, it's pretty rudimentary. It's like phone and email versus I look at a tech company that uses Notion, Slack, does things like they don't email each other for anything that isn't client facing. The internal is all on Slack. They work where the work is, blah, blah, blah. None of that stuff's happening inside of these brokerage houses. And then on top of that, the advice that a lot of these folks are getting are coming from the vice chairmans of the world that have been in the industry for 30 years. And for them to tell young folks this is how you're going to grow your business, it's just fundamentally not the same. I got into the industry around 2012 when social media was starting to take off, and I was being told at that time, get into the office at 6:30, hand the newspaper to your manager to show them that you're there and that you're a great employee. Call and then get into a room and start calling CEOs that are there before the real workday starts, reading the paper and catching up on the news or whatever, right? And I'd make these calls and it was ghost town on the other end, right? And so I'm thinking this doesn't work. And so I started a two-pronged approach. I started using social media as my friend, and I started actually physically getting out there and going to events and things like that to try to build my network in those two sort of bifurcated ways, right? That was 2012. Right? Think about what the crazy thing is, just that these vice chairs and these really senior executives, they're still drafting off of not only 2012 dynamics, they're drafting off of 2000 dynamics. So it's just going to be crazy. To try to round it and answer this question, I think that we're shifting from an eat what you kill brokerage business to maybe something that eventually becomes more like a consulting kind of a role. And I think there'll be less fees and less money to go around in that regard. So the industry is just changing like it has in many other sectors.
So if it moves more consultative, which makes a lot of sense, by the way, as I think about it kind of big picture, in a world where the total pool of money is down and less deals are getting done, being a more consultative partner to clients in order to kind of build that business and support makes a lot of sense. What's your advice for folks who are maybe emerging in this industry now? Go back to 25-year-old Dave Cairns kind of entering in the world as it is today. How do you think about what it means to be a good broker and kind of building your career effectively in that new paradigm?
Honestly, just my first answer is I wouldn't do it. I would say I would think it would be more fascinating actually to work on the customer side, like being inside of the workplace experience and real estate teams or IT teams, or to work for a software company. When I look at what we do at Kadence, the amount of technical questions that we have to field around our software, and the amount of stakeholders that are around the table, from IT, workplace, the people department, like CRHOs, you name it, to make these decisions around commissionable opportunities for our company that pale in comparison to the brokerage world. It shows me how much more complex the decisions are around how to actually optimize and use space than how to actually lease it. So I'm not here saying that brokers won't exist. They absolutely will. It's just probably, if I was speaking to a 25-year-old, I'd say, I think in this moment, you've got different, better opportunities than choosing brokerage.
And obviously that you've made that decision, right? Like you've moved out of the brokerage world, you moved into Kadence. And so I'm curious, you're a few months into this at this point, kind of like, what are some of the big changes? Like what motivated that, in terms of like that being the right decision, and kind of like how is it felt, and what are you learning kind of like being on the other side of it?
Yeah, well, I'll take you back a little bit. So in 2019, I had a customer come to us and say, we think they had 100,000 square feet in Toronto. And they said, we think we need another 80,000 square feet to accommodate like our 7-year growth projections. And because the market is so tight, we want to take any good space that we can get our hands on, but we also don't really want to pay rent on stuff we're not using. So how can we bridge that gap? What can we do? And we came up with a strategy of RFPing several co-working operators before going to the market to lease space directly from a landlord. And it was going to look one of two ways. Either we would separate out the two deals, and the co-working operator would take some space with the landlord, and we would take the other space. Or more likely, we would head lease all of it, indemnify it, and then we would sort of subcontract it out to the co-working operator, and we could kind of agree on tranches that we would call in the future, and in the meantime, they could rent it to the market. That deal didn't happen. They decided to pull back from the deal, but that opened my mind a lot. And I went, this is like, if a customer's trying to solve their own flexibility problems in 2019, and a landlord is not actually there to solve that problem for them, and brokers are kind of fumbling around trying to figure it out, what's the world going to look like in 2030 was kind of the feeling that I had in 2019. So I was trying to figure out how I would move on from brokerage back then. Like my mind was already on that pre-pandemic. But life, is life, and it takes you a while to figure out what to do and how to do it. But transparently, part of the reason I made a shift, just kind of going back to what I said earlier, like, you don't tend to make change in life unless it's forced upon you. I spent a ton of time in 2023 working with flexible co-working operators, trying to help them grow and add more locations. And I was probably in late 2022, early 2023, working on something like 800,000 square feet of active deals. I have 0 deals to account for in that sector. So what I would say is that the exponential growth of the flexible office sector is kind of grossly overstated. Not because I don't say that with any happiness. I actually believe in it a lot. But I think there's 2 factors that are contributing to that. One of them is just the valuation and capital markets methodologies that are out there. They just don't work well for short-term cash flow. But the other is that companies haven't really, on average, adopted a mindset that lends itself to flexible office space. So I think those 2 things together are just kind of stalling out the sector. But because of that, I had one of my worst financial years, which kind of put me in this spot of going like, okay, I haven't been happy doing this for a while. I'm not doing as well as I used to. It's time to think about what is next. And so that's sort of the impetus for how I thought to join Kadence.
And how do you think this picture, it's super interesting to hear, and it makes a ton of sense, right? In terms of both the personal dynamics and the more market dynamics that you're describing. Where do you think this goes? Like you basically have now seen this from a number of different vantage points. You've experienced this as as a poker player in terms of your own location, time control, what that looks like. You've been on the brokerage side. You've worked with newer asset types or like approaches to real estate. You're now thinking about software to support like, we're in 2027, 2030. Like, what do you think this mix looks like in terms of how companies are using space, and what are some of the ways it's going to impact kind of like which types of space maybe win out or kind of like end up becoming more prominent?
Yeah, I think that the really smart companies today, and I'll give an example of a Kadence customer, are using software like ours to do two things. One, massively improve the employee experience of being in a hybrid world. So we really look at our software as being very employee centric. So when an employee logs into Kadence, they're going to get an opportunity to take a look at who among their sort of starred colleagues or people that really matter to them within their organization, what are they doing that week? Where are they likely to be? And how can they make an informed decision about where to show up to work that day? Should it be at home? Should it be at an office? Should it be in a third space? And we really believe in if someone changes their cadence that you, Rob, might want to see that day, and they go from being in office to home, we'll inform you of that. The software will inform you and say, hey, Rob, you were planning to come into the office today. You might not want to because so-and-so is actually not here. You might want to save the commute, or conversely, the opposite, right? So I think where I'm going with this is better people coordination is kind of the moment that we're in right now. Hybrid work is currently a policy. It's not really a product or a strategy. And I don't believe that a technology solution is the be all and end all to helping it shift from a policy to a product. But I think it's essential in the journey to get there. And I think if the average Fortune 100 or 500 can kind of get behind the fact that they need to do something from a change management perspective and from a technology stack perspective to better align digital and in-office experiences so that when people have them, they're feeling good about them, whatever one that is. That's how flexible working starts to become the norm over time. That's how companies can leverage the insights and data that come from platforms like Kadence to be able to say, okay, we've got 100,000 square feet today. Our lease comes up in 2028. We anticipate or suspect we need 40,000 square feet of space, but can we actually get some meaningful data behind that to build executive cases to go and make those really, really risky decisions, right? Because they're risky from the perspective that companies often favor risk mitigation, which in their mind is holding on to space, over optimization. Optimizing becomes the risky thing because what if, as you said earlier in the conversation, they no longer have enough space to match demand on a given day, right? So yeah, I think we're in that kind of a moment.
So I want to pressure test that in some way because a lot of it aligns with my own thinking. But there's an argument to say, okay, maybe companies solve it a different way just through simplicity. They're going to say, hey, look, I'm going to require people to be hybrid, but they're all going to be in on the same days, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Kind of like fixes my understanding of the space in terms of like how much space I need, because it goes back to old paradigms in terms of like, desks in terms of the number of people, simplifies those decisions. And kind of like reduces the need for that kind of like coordination, so to speak. Obviously, there's some meaningful kind of like challenges on the other side of that, but curious what you're seeing or kind of like where you lean in terms of like, is that going to happen at enterprise scale as they try and make these decisions easier, or is the enabling technology going to get good enough to be able to make that problem go away? Curious what your take is.
Yeah, I mean, I think in this moment right now, there's a ton of companies out there that are simply trying to push the easy button, which is our mandate is the following: come in on these days. And I think that within that easy button is sort of acceptance around the fact that they know it's not really going to work out the way that they suggest that it should. And there's a level, this is maybe too strong a word, but like a level of indifference around it where it's just like, well, we need a policy. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that we're still living in a world where defining the policy and just deploying it is sort of where a lot of companies are at. And if that's the mindset, they're not necessarily going to adopt a solution such as Kadence, right? But for the companies that recognize that there needs to be a way better hybrid employee experience, and that a tool should exist within the existing collaboration tool that the employee uses on a day-to-day basis, such as Teams or Slack, and that they can get into that tool and be able to better align in their week to have moments that matter, right? Anything from, booking a desk near a colleague that they hope to see that day, figuring out what event or events are happening over the coming weeks, being able to book a co-working space when they're traveling within the same tool, or really, really great visitor management experiences. And then of course AI, right? Like with our software, you can talk to our AI and you can book any form of space or room or find out what's going on from the perspective of how your portfolio is performing. If you're an admin, someone on the workplace side, for companies that really see it that way, I think our software and anyone that does stuff like what we do becomes really, really sticky. And I guess to close this out, Rob, what I'm finding is that it's challenging sometimes to get someone to the table to see Kadence, but once they get inside our tool, they kind of light up and their brain starts firing about how hybrid could really shift from policy to product with this kind of thing. So yeah, that's generally how I'm seeing it, but it's still a moment that it's all slower than we would like it to be, I guess.
Yep. And I think that's one of the things that people forget often. It feels like the experience of the pandemic is, 20 years in the rear view, and that we've been operating in this model forever. I get asked this question all the time. Why haven't we figured it out? Are you surprised that policies haven't settled? Do you think that we've kind of like hit the new normal? And my answer typically is, I think this is a decades change. Like companies will evolve through decades as enabling technologies, the way you're describing, get better. And companies that are born in this moment mature and figure out tools because they have to, because their company has always been that way. And most adoption of technology or trends happens in cycles, and you've got early adopters and laggards and so on and so forth, right? And we like to believe it's different around hybrid work and implications for office, et cetera, because everyone had this great experiment of having to go remote at the same time. But in reality, while that may have exposed lots of people, I think at the same time too, it doesn't mean it's still not an adoption curve. The companies aren't still going to have to figure this out. And I think that's a longer horizon a lot of people realize.
No, totally. I mean, being thrust into a global working experiment for sure accelerated and totally inflected the whole thing. But when you think about it logically, that's just too much disruption. It has to actually kind of revert back.
Digest it, right?
Yeah.
In some way.
And then incrementally change it. So what I would say is, like, if I was at Kadence trying to pitch what we sell today in 2022, I don't think we'd probably get a lot of attention on it. I think 2024 and 2025 are finally the years where a lot of organizations are going, okay, we've established the policy, but now we actually need to do things to turn it from a policy into a product. And it'll still take time, but I think we're at that moment where that recognition is there.
It's well said. Dave, I always enjoy chatting with you about these topics. I think you're so thoughtful about both the employee experience of it and from your personal perspective, but also professional perspective, which you've had a wide range of experiences, I think, that contribute to the way you think about this. For folks that are interested in learning more about you or reading more of your thinking, where should we send them?
Yeah, thank you for the conversation and for those nice words. I would say follow me on LinkedIn first and foremost. I love putting out Flex Index research too, so you'll definitely find me doing that. And then I've also recently started a newsletter called Beyond Hybrid, where at Kadence, we're trying to not only help with the current moment, but help organizations think about what might lie beyond this undeniably hybrid moment.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Dave. Again, I always appreciate the conversation, and I think a lot of people will enjoy hearing what you have to say.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, you can subscribe on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Please also consider giving us a rating or leaving a review, as that helps other listeners find the podcast. For more Flex Index content, including past episodes, our Flex Index newsletter, and monthly research reports, visit flex.scoopforwork.com. See you next time.